Welcome to the FantasyLabs podcast. This is Brian. I'm here with Jay. We're in part 2 of our mini-series about breaking down some tournaments for MLB DFS. We did the $3 moonshot last week. Part 2 is going to be a different tournament. It's going to be the DraftKings Midsummer Classic that took place this week. The entry level was $333. There was 2,500 teams that entered, and it was $150,000 for first place. So this was sort of a unique tournament in that it was a high-stakes tournament. If you call $333 high stakes, I guess that's sort of relative. A high-stakes tournament, but with still a high number of teams at 2,500. So definitely a really nice tournament, and one that we wanted to break down because there's a lot of interesting stuff that happened in this tournament, and I think really shows a lot of the things that we discussed in the initial podcast when we talked about 10 different ways to be contrarian. There's several of those in this one tournament at the top of the leaderboard. So we're going to discuss that. And as usual, I'm here with my partner in crime, Jay Pearson. What's going on, dude?
Lots of crime going on here. It's going well, Yeah, I just want to reiterate how cool this tournament was, especially kind of for the end of July. I think it's pretty awesome. DK just rolled out this $750K tournament. We had 3 of the Midsummer Classics based on different tier buy-in levels. So this one was definitely cool. And yeah, I think you're definitely safe to say 333 is considered high stakes buy-in. So not sure how many of our listeners played this, but it still gives you, our breakdown will kind of give you a mindset of how to attack these tournaments if you do play them in the future or whatever. Yeah, it was great. I mean, you had the max entries were at 100, which was pretty high. Saw a few guys actually reach that max. They ended up doing well. And you look at the tournament as a whole, the rake was 11%, which I think at this point in the industry is pretty standard. So, I'm fine with that. That's the way it is. So we can't really change that. But 11% was fine. So overall, this was a great tournament, even though it filled. We always like some overlay. But this is definitely a tournament, I think, if you're waiting to pony up on a tournament or kind of get that big hit, 150K, this was a really good one to target. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Yeah, definitely. And even if your bankroll doesn't allow you to play in a tournament like this, so you might think that this podcast isn't applicable to you and where your buy-in levels are at, I think it's always good, even if you're not playing at the higher levels, to look at what the high-level tournaments, how they're shaped, what players are being used in the ownerships, because this is just the way that it is the higher the stakes, the sharper the plays. These guys that are playing high stakes are really sharp players, and it's always a good idea to study the best players in the industry. And we see a couple of those. We have Asani, we have the Clone, it's up 2 and 3. So in this tournament, so it's always good, even if you're not playing on DraftKings, you can actually just go to the site and click the live button any night for any sport and look at any tournament and pull that. So it's always good to track those, and it's very easy to do. We're going to break this one down, but I encourage you to, even after this podcast, to definitely do the same for sure. Okay, let's jump into this one. So again, the Midsummer Classic, 333 is 2,500 teams. The top place was to a user called Amateur Hour, a guy that I've never heard of, but congratulations to him.
Yeah, nice win.
Yeah, walked home with 150K, not a bad prize there. He had Chris Archer and Tyler Skaggs as his 2 pitchers, which we're definitely going to get into because that was sort of interesting, especially the ownership levels here. He had Buster Posey, David Ortiz, Daniel Murphy, Anthony Rendon, Francisco Lindor, Mookie Betts, Adam Duvall, Matt Kemp. So sort of definitely a mixture of guys here. And I guess the first thing that I noticed here, and we can mention this, is the $3 moonshot that we talked about last week, Jay, was a Boston first baseman and Buster Posey, and the winner here had a Boston first baseman, Buster Posey. So apparently we can just stop here and just say roster of Boston first baseman and Buster Posey, and you'll just win tournaments.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's like an episode of Stranger Things that they tackle that, but I think it's nothing more than just a mere coincidence, of course. But, it is pretty cool that the 2 tournaments we talked about both had a Boston first base. But you look at Boston overall, especially lately, and they're just implied run total. They were just implied as so much more runs than any other team. Were they at 6.8? I think this game or this slate. So that's just massive. They've been implied a lot. I mean, they're facing Mike Pelfrey, so automatically I think you look at this slate, you say, okay, Boston's going to be the highest owned team. And I think you look at this top team, the team that took it down, and they didn't have a stack at all in their entire team, and they faded the stack, which I think is really interesting. Something we can kind of get into a little bit more, but it was pretty spread out as far as exposure to different players. Obviously, they had some Boston in there, but overall, I thought it was interesting in a 2,500 person tournament that the winner had no stacks. That's definitely interesting.
Yeah, they had pairs of teammates, so if you call it.
Right. Yeah.
That's not really a stack. But it does show, and this is something that we had talked about in our initial podcast, where contrarian doesn't mean that every single spot in your lineup has to be contrarian.
Right.
The goal is to have a unique lineup that still has upside. And you don't have to just fade every chalk guy. I mean, David Ortiz and Mookie Betts were obviously chalk batters in the slate. I mean, I'd score almost 7 runs, and those are the 2 best batters in that lineup, and generally just 2 of the best batters in the league anyway. And they were high owned. Ortiz was 14% owned, and Mookie was 21. You don't have to fade them. The goal is just to get a unique lineup. So we've seen not only at this tournament, but also in the lower stakes tournament, really just across the board, you can get exposure to these really optimal plays and then just be unique elsewhere.
Right. Yeah. And I think, the hitting in this lineup, they had 5 guys under 3% owned. So I think that's an easy way to get contrarian, especially when you are going 2 guys on Boston, the best 2, Mookie and Big Papi. So I think it's important to remember that when you do go guys on clearly the highest owned team, you have to mix in some random, or not random, but different plays that have lower ownership. So I think they did a good job at that. And I think real quick, we can talk about the pitching if you want to get into that with Chris Archer, and then we can briefly talk about Tyler Skaggs, I suppose.
Yeah, very interesting. So the 2 things that you have to the 2 ways that you can approach a slate pretty much any day is you can pay it for pitching and take cheap bats, or you can take cheap pitching do the opposite. Ideally, you would want to take the Boston Red Sox and take a high-priced pitcher, but you can't. So you have to make concessions and figure out which way you want to do. It seems like in the smaller slates, people more often take the top pitching and then try to find cheaper bats, whereas it seems in higher stakes in this tournament is an example of this. These guys are much more willing to take a cheaper pitcher, or a pitcher who is not necessarily like a high-rated pitcher in a player model, or doesn't have like a crazy low run projection of their opposition. It looks like Chris Archer was implied to give up 4 runs. Tyler Skaggs was up in the 4-5 range. So these are not guys where, like, if you're looking at a cash game model, are going to rate highly because of the Vegas runs, but still have some decent upside. Chris Archer, we know, is a high strikeout guy. But yeah, it's just sort of interesting how the high stakes and lower stakes are different in that way. However, and I know you played this tournament and you had Chris Archer. I was not expecting Archer to be 30% owned pretty much.
Yeah, that was very surprising to me. I thought I was pulling a fast one on the field and like, I'm all over Archer. I liked Archer a lot in this game, going to the NL, facing a team with a pitcher instead of his usual DH. So I was on Archer. He was, according to our K predictor, implied to strike out the most hitters out of any pitcher on the slate. And that's something I put a lot of weight into with our models, our tools looking at. It's my favorite stat to look at when selecting pitchers. And you kind of just had a lot of pitchers that didn't stand out. So in that regard, I guess I can see Archer moving himself above the pack with his strikeout upside. But yeah, I was still really surprised. I mean, there were a couple other options. And I think what was interesting is we didn't really have too many high-priced guys. I mean, you look at the top of the salary, it was Kyle Hendricks and Stephen Wright, and I wasn't on either of them. Hendricks facing a DH, and Stephen Wright has been due for regression for quite some time now, this entire season. So I was kind of off them, and then we kind of get into Salazar, who was actually my second pitcher, and I did not like it at all. I just couldn't find another. I don't know. I mean, I choked clearly, but Salazar was a guy. I think this is a lot of hindsight, but even at the time I didn't feel good about, was facing a tough Nationals team, healthy Nationals team with Ryan Zimmerman back. They gained a DH, which turned out to be Ben Revere. hitting 9-hole, I believe, with Trey Turner leading off. So it was a pretty solid lineup, a healthy team. So I think you look at Salazar, he wasn't like a clear cut. I was surprised actually at his ownership too. At a point, I thought there'd be a bit more contrarian plays overall. I mean, there were at the top, but I guess percentages wise, it kind of threw me off with especially the Archer, almost 30%.
Yeah, and I think it's guys that are much more willing to take high upside guys and beat off of Vegas.
Yeah.
I think it definitely makes sense, to get a floor in these smaller field tournaments. You just get a floor from your pitcher, so you can load up on a high-priced guy who is implied to not allow a whole lot of runs, and then hopefully your bats go off. Whereas in a tournament like this, where you have to be a little bit sharper, it makes more sense to maybe get off of the Vegas train and get more on like the high upside when it comes to our like K predictor or something like that. And you're right, Chris Archer was the highest guy. I didn't think that would turn into 28.5% ownership.
No,
but you're right. It was sort of unique, and there weren't many good pitchers.
Yeah,
Tyler Skaggs is an interesting one. A guy who hadn't pitched in a year. He's coming off Tommy John surgery. I did not see this one at all.
No, it's almost been 2 years since he pitched last, and
that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, and he was almost 9% owned, which I thought was crazy. Look at the winning lineup at amateur hour. I just thought, looking at it, I thought it was an amateur play to go Skaggs. Very interesting. 2 years off, coming off Tommy John surgery. I don't know what indications there were to make him kind of a viable candidate on your teams, outside of just kind of an off the wall contrarian play. So, I mean, even after the game, Skaggs quoted himself, said, it went a lot better than expected. I didn't expect much. So it's like, what made you think he would crush this game? I mean, the Royals have been slumping, struggling to hit lately. So I guess you can see from that regard, I'm just trying to kind of see what thought process went into it. I don't want to like dwell on it or anything, because I understand how some of these teams make their line, or how some of these guys make their lineups and just throw some pitchers in. He might have fit the salary. There are a lot of reasons, so I don't want to spend this whole pot on Tyler Skaggs. But for me, I didn't really love the play, and he's certainly a guy I didn't consider. And I think you look at the overall top list, and it's interesting. I mean, we'll get into this a bit more in a minute, but you look at the Clone and the Sani and kind of their plays. These guys, they're very experienced tournament players, two of the most successful, probably the most successful in MLB right now.
Yeah.
And so you can break down those teams more than amateur hour, I guess. But he took it down, and Skaggs came through. So that's all that matters at this point.
Yeah, it's easy to have confirmation bias in tournaments like these, because it's easy to try to figure out why Tyler Skaggs was a good play because he ended up being a good play. But sometimes a guy just wasn't a good play. It is weird. You're right. The Royals had been slumping. I actually checked that out. They had scored, I think, 1 run the game before, 2 runs the game prior to that. So a little bit of a mini slump. So maybe just taking the flyer there. 9% still is a lot higher for a flyer guy that's got Tommy John surgery after a long layoff,
Definitely.
We don't talk about that. Yeah,
that's true. I mean, you look at the Royals, and I think overall it's a team this season that people might still be scared of after last year and just their low strikeout total. They're just not the same team. They're not as great at hitting. So I think that might still be in people's mindsets of, I'm going to never take a pitcher against the Royals, when that's just completely untrue this season, especially.
Yeah. All right. So we're not talking about Skaggs anymore. Interesting play, but definitely don't have confirmation bias. Was he a good play in hindsight? Maybe. I don't know. I think you and I both agreed that we don't think that's the case. You can make that call for yourself. But, yeah, when you're looking at these tournaments, don't just get fooled by the top lineup and say everyone was a good play because they were the winning lineup. That's not how it works. And that's really not the point of the process of going over these.
Right.
All right, so let's get into the hitter. So I think one thing that was the most interesting to me, obviously, even though the winning lineup amateur hour didn't have any Angels bats, the Angels went off for 13 run. They didn't have amateur hour didn't have any Angels bats in his lineup, but if you go down through the next several, Asani and the Clone, they definitely had Angels. They actually had Angel stacks. And this is something that we got into, Jay, in our initial pod with 10 ways to be contrarian. And one of our favorite ways that we had said was was to go down just a little bit when you're looking at Vegas implied run totals of teams, just to dip down a little bit. You had the Red Sox that was 6.5 runs. There's a lot of teams that actually were implied for a whole bunch of runs in this slate. But then you go down to a team like the Angels, they're still implied for 4.6 runs. Like that, just sort of relative to MLB slates in general, outside of tonight or outside of this night, is a very good number. Yet because of the slate, they're super low owned. Like Asani, we'll talk about him. He had an Angel stack, and some of these guys are ridiculous. Albert Pujols, who we know has upside, was 1.4% owned. Escobar, Escobar was 0.8% owned. Andrelton Simmons was a little bit lower in the order at 6, but he was 0.4% owned. Calhoun was 1.4. Mike Trout obviously was a little bit higher, but it's because it's Mike Trout. He was part of that stack. It's just ridiculous. I mean, 4.6 runs and they're less than 1% owned.
Yeah, and he completed the stack, Asani, with Tyler Skaggs, which is even crazier. Yeah, I think it's very important to talk about that a little bit more in terms of the Angels, or we talked about a few ways to get contrarian in that initial pod, and it was teams that are kind of in the middle with implied runs, just based off the variance of baseball. Just because you're not at the top doesn't mean you don't have the capability of scoring the most runs. I mean, it's a very high variance sport. So you look at the Angels and the Giants, and they kind of connected on two of our contrarian ways, in that they were late games. The Giants lineup came out really late. I ended up going with a Giants stack on my team. So you look at these teams, 4.6 and 4.5, you can kind of assume almost that they're going to have low ownership, these stacks. You can have a strong feeling that they're going to be low owned just at the run total. And we had 7 teams on this slate that were implied over 5 runs, which is a lot. The Red Sox at 6.8. We had a lot of other teams high. So I think you look at these middle teams, and yeah, you're right. On other slates, 4.6 is a pretty solid amount, and that's not a team you necessarily want to just fade overall. So I think in terms of being contrarian, this 2,500 person tournament, I think the Angels were a great play. They have been hitting better. It's actually a pretty good lineup when they're cruising. I mean, Simmons was the guy who really came through, 0.4%. Or not Simmons, I'm sorry, Escobar, both former Braves.
0.8%, yeah.
0.8%, and he really came through big time. And you look at the Giants and Brandon Crawford, very similar, low ownership, shortstop, but he came through as well. So these are guys that, as standalone plays, you would never play. I mean, I would never look at this player pool and be like, I'm really going to get a lot of Brandon Crawford and Escobar in my lineups with Red Sox stacks. That's just not going to happen. So you put them in this Giants and Angels stacks, though, and that's kind of how you maximize your upside. If that player who is going to be low owned goes off, and then you couple that with the rest of the team and get that correlation. So that's what these guys, Asani and the clone, seasoned vets of MLB tournaments, both had an Angels stack. And yeah, they had a lot of lineups. The max was 100, and I think Asani had 100 and the clone had 75. So it's a lot of money to put up front, of course. There are plenty of other guys who put up a lot of money and then place in the top 5. So I think these guys are kind of showing how good they are and strategizing as a whole throughout their lineups. That doesn't mean that you can't throw in one entry and go a team like the Angels or Giants yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And what I really like about these lineups, and we sort of harping on this, but I think it's so important, is you don't have to be contrarian everywhere. Like Asani had this Angels stack and stacked 5 players from the Angels, and obviously got Mike Trout, who was a little bit chalkier, but you're right, included like really low owned guys in Escobar, who ended up having 25 DK points. I mean, that's huge at 0.8% owned. But then he also had, some chalkier guys. He got some exposure to Boston with Jackie Bradley, who hit a home run at 21 points. And you don't have to be contrarian everywhere. You can take that stack and still get the chalky guys because your stack is so low owned, And also really interesting is this Wilson Ramos play. And this is another sort of thing. It's not something that we address hyper specifically in our podcast, but taking a player, if you don't believe in the best pitcher of the night, and it was Salazar who was the sort of the chalky play. Right. If you don't believe in him, a really good strategy to do is not only fade him but take a guy against him, because if he if he struggles, not only is he struggling and therefore your lineup without him is going to go up because all those are going to go down, but you're also reaping the benefits of him struggling. So you're sort of, it's almost like double dipping. It's not exactly similar to like taking a special teams player and a punt returner.
Yeah, can't wait for that. Yeah.
He's all about that, man. He mentions it like every pod.
Yeah, he probably mentions those on the golf pods too. Just habit, but yeah, you're right. I mean, I think it's a very savvy move, strong move, kind of taking hitters against the chalkiest pitcher because you know that their ownership is going to be low, and especially I think we could do a full pod just on the catcher position. Regardless, I mean, it's such an interesting, unique position with ownership levels and upside. I mean, you have so many catchers who suck at hitting but have home run potential, and you know, Ramos is obviously a much better catcher than most, so him at 1.3% ownership I like a lot.
And he was batting cleanup that night.
Right. Yeah. So that's a strong play. And then you look at the clone and same thing, you know, had a lot of Angels guys mixed in a few. Actually, the clone's lineup was interesting in that he split two stacks. So he stacked the Angels and the Brewers. I think this is a thing a lot of players do, and I think it's something even on FanDuel especially you can do a lot with the 4 and 4. Is just stack two teams, and you hit on these two teams, and you look at the clone. I mean, you know, got third place, just simple. I mean, this lineup theoretically could have taken him 5 seconds to make, and you know, paid out $40,000. Obviously, I'm sure he spent more time overall, of course, but I mean, you look and you stack two teams that are under-owned. Obviously, the Brewers were in a great spot. You know, the Angels at that low ownership. And so he went, you know, just two teams, and then Archer we talked about. And then we didn't really mention Tom Kohler, but he was a guy, you know, was, I think, a great play. Look at the Phillies, obviously opponent. Pitchers facing the Phillies have a plus-minus of 1.8 on DraftKings, which is the second most favorable team to face behind the Padres at 2.0. And then the third best team is the Brewers at 1. So you look at the difference compared to all teams, it's pretty high. So I like that play a lot at 10%. Was pretty sharp. So, I mean, both these teams assigning the clone. I mean, like you said, you don't have to even play this tournament to kind of get an insight and strategy. You can go to the live page and look at some of these top players who play these tournaments every night. Even if they throw in a lot of entries, you could still learn a lot by their strategies.
For sure. Yeah, and I do want to mention the double stack. I think that it's an astute point because we had talked about in our early podcast, the reason that we love stacking so much is not just because of like the positive correlation between the teammates. That is part of it. You know, like if a team goes off, a lot of those guys are going to go off in tandem and you're going to get all the points. If the guy hits a home run with another guy on base, you're going to get, you know, the run from him, plus you're going to get so it's correlations. We know about that. But also what makes stacking so optimal and powerful is because you also don't have to hit on that position. Like if you take 5 guys, that is, you know, those positions, if that team goes off, as opposed to just taking one guy from that team, you don't have to hit on the other 4 positions. If you don't stack, you have to be perfect on every play. You have to assume that that player is going to go off or going to have a big game, and that's just really hard to do. Statistically, it's just not probable for you to hit on a batter for every position, and stacking is a way to limit your you don't have to do that as much. And so that's why I think a double stack is a good idea too, because you're limited even more. You know, you don't have to hit on 4 or 5 guys and then hit on each, you know, independent position, take 3 guys. If you take a 5-guy stack, you don't have to hit 3 other positions independently. If you go 4-4, if you go 5-3, and those 2 teams go off, then you're good. You don't have to hit on the independent positions. That's such a critical part that I think people miss in stacking.
Yeah, and I think you look at the top 3 in this tournament, you know, we have Amateur Hour, who we can question all day with his lineup or whatever. He won it, obviously. But you look at Asani and the clone. These guys just can't stress enough how good they are at MLB and at tournament strategy. They both have stacks, and I think this just reiterates kind of my feelings on tournaments for MLB, in that generally I'm always going to have a stack in one way or the other. And if I'm multi-entering, I'm going to multi-enter stacks or have a lot of the same stacks with different pieces elsewhere. So it's just a strategy I think is great for MLB. It's proven to be a winning strategy for years now. Even with the rules changes, there are always ways to kind of still get contrarian with your stacks.
Yeah, and I think we've mentioned those. You could double stack, which we like, and then stack a lower implied team. And like the Angels are a team that was implied for lower runs than other teams. I think you had mentioned earlier that there were 7 teams that were implied to score like 5.5 runs or more, or something like that, or 5 runs or more.
Yeah, over 5.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. But that means that a team that's implied to score in the 4.6, 4.8 range, just right below that, which is still a lot of runs, is going to have very, very low ownership, but still have upside.
I think it's just important to kind of utilize, in cash games, you really want to focus on Vegas lines. It helps a lot. I mean, with the Red Sox at 6.8, you certainly want some Red Sox in your cash game lineup. Tournaments are just so different in that I wouldn't necessarily use Vegas lines in the same way. I would use them more to predict ownership and kind of base on what the public is going to do. So when you see all these high-owned teams, look at these middle teams, the Giants and Angels too, that come to mind, that obviously did well too, of course, but those are guys that are left off on a lot of people's lists. They only have so many entries, or they're only playing one. They want to get that top team. The Blue Jays were high. The Orioles against the Rockies were high. They both busted.
Yep.
We had a couple other teams bust. The Red Sox crushed, but you look at the top 3, and they didn't even have a Red Sox stack. So these low-owned teams, in my one entry, I went with the Giants stack. I liked them a lot against the left-handed pitcher. You look at Belt's reverse splits in the last year, 406 WOBA, 262 ISO against lefties, and then obviously Posey, who I knew was going to be high-owned, 401 WOBA, 224 ISO versus lefties. You had a unique lineup. This was one that came out that we knew was going to come out late. And I think this is another thing you can do, is use our lineups page to look at these projected lineups. You can see that Mac Williamson was in the projected lineup. He was hitting 3 holes, so I ended up going with the 3 through 6 stack. And, I kind of knew that these guys would be under-owned outside of Posey. So the stack hits, you're going to cash. And, I did cost myself $9,200 switching from Billy Hamilton to Mark Trumbo at the last second, which I did the math. That's over 1,300 meals at Chick-fil-A that I lost myself, which is kind of how I base my monetary principles is on food. So that one definitely hurt. All that Chick-fil-A that is gone now because of that. But the Giants stack I think was great. There are a lot of instances like that. I think you could capitalize on those types of teams with those implied run totals that people are going to overlook. It's kind of reiterated in this tournament. I know it's a small sample size, but we've seen 2 tournaments now that we've broken down, and this just happens so often that you're looking for these big hits. You're not looking to kind of just cash these. So you don't always want to stack the Red Sox when they're the highest owned. You're just competing with too many people. So you might stack a middle team according to Vegas and lose 5 nights in a row, but on that 6th night, you might take down the tournament.
Exactly. And the great news about these tournaments is that they happen all the time. So you lost all that Chick-fil-A, that theoretical Chick-fil-A, but you have an opportunity to win it back.
Right. Oh, yeah. I'll get the Chick-fil-A back one way or the other. Probably our next tournament we break down, I think we should focus maybe on a FanDuel tournament for the next one and throw a bunch of entries. And I think that'll be interesting with the 4x4 stack process, stacking 2 teams. Definitely utilize. But, yeah, this was a great tournament. I think you see at the top kind of some strategies that some well-known players went with and cashed big with and, made a lot of money.
Yeah, for sure. That was a good one to break down and hit on a lot of the contrarian ideas that we had mentioned in our first podcast. So it was definitely a good one. It's always fun to talk about things in theory and hypothetically, but it's actually good to see them in practice in a real tournament where people are winning real money. So congrats to Amateur Hour and the guys below him. Fun one to break down. And thanks for breaking it down with me, Jay. I guess
definitely
a FanDuel one next week.
Yeah, I think it's only fair.
Only fair, yeah. And maybe you'll win that one, so you could eat Chick-fil-A while we break it down.
Yeah, it's gonna be tough. Maybe Trumbo will come around and not get the goose egg this time, so that'd be nice.
Perfect.
But yeah, maybe I'll eat Chick-fil-A on the pod after a winning lineup. That'd be awesome.
Sounds great. Okay, well, everyone, thanks for listening to these. We appreciate your listens as always. It's always good to go over your process, and we'll definitely keep these going. We'll do a FanDuel one next week and keep it going as long as I think we have interesting things to talk about, which could be a while, but we'll see. So tune in next week. We'll talk to you guys later.
See you guys.